On a hilltop overlooking Granada, Spain, there stands a palace that was never supposed to endure, the Alhambra. The name means red fortress in Arabic, red walls rising from weathered stone, courtyards filled with geometric tilework, water channels carved through marble. A complex spanning 35 acres, constructed between the 13th and 15th centuries as the seat of the Nasrid dynasty. The last Islamic kingdom in Western Europe ruled from these halls. After conquest in 1492, the palace changed purpose and nearly vanished entirely. It served as a prison, military barracks, home to squatters who lived among crumbling stucco and dry fountains. In 1812, French troops placed explosives throughout the complex and lit the fuses. Demolition crews stood ready decades later to reduce what remained to salvage. That never happened. This is the story of a palace that refused to disappear. A story that begins long before architects drafted plans or workers shaped stone. Understanding the Alhambra requires understanding the kingdom that built it, and that kingdom began as an act of survival. Muhammad ibn Yusuf ibn Nasr rode into the city of Granada and declared it his capital. He was 42 years old and controlled a shrinking territory in southern Iberia. Most of what Muslims called Al-Andalus had already fallen to Christian kingdoms expanding from the north. Cordoba had fallen in 1236. Seville would fall in 1248. The Islamic presence in the Iberian Peninsula, which had endured for over 500 years, was collapsing. Muhammad understood his position. He lacked the military strength to resist Castile or Aragon in open warfare. His army numbered perhaps 3,000 men. Ferdinand III of Castile commanded tens of thousands. Direct confrontation meant certain defeat. He chose a different strategy. In 1246, Muhammad traveled to the Castilian court and offered himself as vassal to Ferdinand III. The terms were explicit. Granada would pay annual tribute to Castile. In exchange, Ferdinand would recognize Muhammad's right to rule his territory without interference. The tribute started at 150,000 maravedis annually, roughly equivalent to 12,000 gold dinars. It was a substantial sum, but it purchased something invaluable: time. The arrangement offended some in Granada who viewed it as surrender. Muhammad saw it as survival. Castile gained revenue without the cost of conquest. Granada gained breathing space to build wealth and fortifications. Both sides benefited from the fiction that Muhammad ruled independently while Ferdinand looked elsewhere for expansion. Geography favored this strategy. Granada occupied territory protected by the Sierra Nevada mountain range to the east and south. The mountains created natural barriers against invasion. Winter snows closed the passes. Summer heat made prolonged campaigns difficult. Any army approaching from Castile faced supply problems and defensive choke points. The city itself sat at the confluence of the Darro and Genil rivers. Water was abundant. Agricultural land in the surrounding Vega produced grain, olives, and fruit. The Mediterranean coast lay 50 miles south, providing access to maritime trade networks. That trade became Granada's economic foundation. The kingdom controlled silk production. Mulberry groves throughout the territory fed silkworms. Granada's weavers produced silk fabric that sold throughout the Mediterranean and North Africa. Genoese and Venetian merchants maintained trading posts in Granada's port of Almeria, exchanging European goods for Granada's silk, ceramics, and metalwork. Additional revenue came from gold. Trans-Saharan trade routes terminated in North African ports, particularly Ceuta and Tangier. Granada's proximity to Morocco gave it access to West African gold flowing north. Muhammad negotiated trade agreements with the Marinid dynasty in Morocco. Gold coins minted in Granada circulated widely. The tribute to Castile was expensive, but Granada's economy could sustain it. By the late 13th century, Granada's annual revenue exceeded 400,000 dinars. The tribute consumed roughly 8% of that total. The remaining 92% funded administration, defense, and construction. Population growth strengthened the kingdom. As Christian forces conquered other Islamic territories in Iberia, Muslim refugees fled south to Granada. Craftsmen from Cordoba brought specialized skills in metalwork and leatherworking. Scholars from Seville carried manuscripts and knowledge. Farmers, displaced from the countryside, settled in Granada's agricultural zones. The kingdom's population swelled from perhaps 100,000 inches, 1,238, to over 300,000 by 1300. Muhammad needed a palace that projected permanence. The old Zirid fortress on the Sabika Hill overlooked Granada from the east. Roman fortifications had occupied the site centuries earlier. Visigoths had maintained defenses there. The location offered tactical advantages. The hill rose 150 feet above the city. Attackers would face uphill assaults. Defenders could see approaching threats from miles away. Muhammad began construction in 1238. The first priority was military infrastructure. The Al-Qazaba, the fortress section, occupied the western tip of the hill. Massive walls 30 feet tall surrounded the perimeter. Towers positioned at regular intervals provided overlapping fields of fire. Underground cisterns stored water to withstand siege. Barracks housed the garrison. Arsenals held weapons and supplies. The soil on Sabika Hill had a reddish color from its clay and iron content. Workers excavating foundations piled red earth outside the walls. The fortress took on a distinctive appearance. Locals began calling it Al-Qala al-Hamra, the Red Fortress. The name stuck. Alhambra. Muhammad I ruled until his death in 1273. His son Muhammad II continued expanding the complex. The military fortress was functional but austere. Muhammad II began transforming sections into residential quarters. He commissioned living spaces with courtyards and gardens. Water channels were dug to supply fountains. The palace was evolving beyond pure military necessity. Muhammad III, who ruled from 1302 to 1309, accelerated the transformation. He constructed the Mekshawar, an administrative complex where government business was conducted. Public audiences occurred there. Officials met to discuss policy and settle disputes. The Alhambra was becoming the kingdom's nerve center, not merely its defensive stronghold. By the early 14th century, Granada had achieved something remarkable. A small tributary state had become the wealthiest city in Iberia. Trade revenues exceeded those of Castilian cities twice its size. The kingdom's gold dinars circulated as reliable currency throughout the Mediterranean. Granada's silk competed with Byzantine and Persian fabrics in international markets. The contrast was striking. Castile and Aragon were consumed by internal conflicts and succession disputes. Their economies struggled with agricultural shortfalls and monetary instability. Granada, supposedly the subordinate partner, thrived while its overlords stagnated. The Nasrid strategy was working. Pay tribute to avoid conquest. Use the resulting stability to build economic strength. Invest that wealth in infrastructure and culture. The Alhambra embodied this approach. It began as a defensive fortress because survival required military capacity. But defense alone couldn't justify the kingdom's existence. Granada needed to demonstrate that it represented something worth preserving. That demonstration would require architecture that announced Islamic civilization's sophistication, gardens that evoked paradise, scholarship that preserved and advanced human knowledge. The hilltop fortress was ready for transformation. But transformation required vision, resources, and architects who understood how buildings could project power as effectively as armies. The foundations were in place. The walls stood solid. The cisterns held water. The kingdom had stabilized its finances and secured its borders through pragmatic diplomacy. Muhammad III died in 1309. His successors would inherit a stable realm and a partially completed palace. The question was whether they possessed the imagination to complete what had been started, whether they could transform a red fortress into something that would outlast the kingdom itself. Yusuf I inherited the throne of Granada in 1333. He was 16 years old. His father, Ismail I, had been assassinated by a cousin in the throne room of the Alhambra, stabbed while hearing petitions from subjects. The murder created uncertainty about succession. Rival claimants emerged within the Nasrid family. Civil war threatened. Yusuf moved quickly. He secured the loyalty of Granada's military garrison. He obtained recognition from Castile, confirming that Granada's tribute obligations would continue under his rule. He executed the cousin who had killed his father and any conspirators who might challenge his authority. Within months, he controlled the kingdom. The treasury he inherited was substantial. Decades of silk trade had filled Granada's coffers. The tribute payments to Castile, while significant, consumed only a fraction of annual revenue. Yusuf had resources to deploy. The question was how. He had been educated in the traditional Islamic sciences, mathematics, particularly geometry, astronomy for calculating prayer times and religious calendars, Quranic studies and Islamic jurisprudence, poetry in classical Arabic. His tutors had come from across the Islamic world, bringing intellectual traditions from Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad. Yusuf understood that Granada's survival depended on more than military defense or commercial success. The kingdom needed to justify its existence culturally. It needed to demonstrate that Islamic civilization in Iberia remained vital, sophisticated, worthy of preservation. Architecture could make that argument in ways that diplomacy could not. The fortress on Sabika Hill was functional, but austere. It announced military strength, but not cultural achievement. Yusuf wanted something that would impress foreign ambassadors, not with defensive walls, but with intellectual sophistication embedded in stone and tile. He began recruiting. Architects arrived from Morocco, where the Marinid dynasty was constructing elaborate mosques and madrasas. Craftsmen came from Granada's own workshops and from across the Mediterranean. Hydraulic engineers who understood water management in arid climates. Master tile makers who could execute complex geometric patterns. Stucco carvers capable of creating three-dimensional arabesques. Calligraphers who could render Quranic verses and poetry in ornamental scripts. The first major project under Yusuf's direction was the Khmer's Palace, which would include the Court of the Myrtles and the Hall of the Ambassadors. Construction began in the late 1330s. The design followed principles that were theological as much as aesthetic. Islamic art avoided figurative representation of humans or animals. The prohibition forced artists and architects toward abstraction. Geometric patterns became the vocabulary through which beauty and meaning were expressed. These weren't arbitrary decorations. They represented mathematical relationships that Islamic scholars believed reflected divine order. The universe, in Islamic cosmology, operated according to geometric principles established by God. Architecture that embodied those principles was architecture that pointed toward the divine. Water was equally important. The Quran describes paradise as gardens with rivers flowing beneath. For Muslims living in Mediterranean climates where water was scarce, the sound and sight of flowing water carried both practical and spiritual significance. A palace with fountains and channels wasn't just comfortable, it was a preview of paradise. The engineering challenge was formidable. The Alhambra sat on a hill 230 feet above the city. The nearest substantial water source was the Darro River in the valley below. Moving water uphill required aqueducts, channels carved through rock, and hydraulic systems that could maintain pressure over distance. Yusuf commissioned the construction of the Acequia Real, the Royal Channel. The aqueduct diverted water from the Darro River approximately 5 miles upstream from Granada. The channel followed the contours of the hillside, descending gradually to maintain flow while delivering water to the palace at sufficient elevation to feed fountains and pools throughout the complex. Underground cisterns stored reserves. Distribution channels carved through the palace foundations carried water to every courtyard and garden. Yusuf died in 1354. Likely poisoned by political rivals. His son, Muhammad V, inherited both the throne and the construction project. Muhammad was 20 years old. He had watched his father's work for 2 decades. He understood the vision. Muhammad V's reign was interrupted. In 1359, his half-brother overthrew him with support from Castilian forces. Muhammad fled to Morocco, where the Marinid Sultan offered sanctuary. He spent 3 years in exile studying the palaces and mosques of Fez. When he regained the throne in 1362 with military backing from the King of Castile, he returned to Granada with expanded architectural ambitions. The Court of the Lions, the Alhambra's most famous space, was constructed during Muhammad V's reign between 1362 and 1391. The courtyard measured approximately 90 feet by 50 feet. surrounded by galleries supported by 124 slender marble columns. At the center stood a fountain featuring 12 stone lions supporting a basin. Water flowed from the lions' mouths through channels carved into the courtyard pavement, dividing the space into 4 quadrants, representing the 4 rivers of paradise. The surrounding galleries featured muqarnas vaults, a distinctive element of Islamic architecture. Muqarnas are 3-dimensional geometric structures, resembling honeycomb or stalactites. Each individual cell is a precisely calculated shape that interlocks with adjacent cells to create complex domed or vaulted surfaces. The effect is mesmerizing, a ceiling that appears to dissolve into countless facets of light and shadow. The Hall of the Two Sisters, opening off the Court of the Lions, featured a muqarnas dome composed of over 5,000 individual cells. Each cell was carved from stucco and assembled on site. The mathematical precision required to design such a structure without modern calculating tools demonstrated the sophistication of Islamic geometry. Throughout the palace, surfaces were covered with decorative elements. Zellige tiles in geometric patterns, carved stucco with arabesque designs, calligraphic inscriptions in Arabic. The inscriptions included verses from the Quran and poems commissioned specifically for the palace. Ibn al-Khatib served as Muhammad V's vizier and court poet in the 1360 seconds. His student, Ibn Zamrak, succeeded him in the 1370 seconds. Ibn Zamrak's poetry was carved directly into the palace walls, becoming permanent features of the architecture. One inscription in the Hall of the Two Sisters reads, "I am a garden adorned with beauty. Gaze upon my loveliness, and you will know this to be true." The Nasrid motto appeared throughout the complex. Wala Ghalib ila Allah, there is no victor but God. The phrase acknowledged that Granada's survival depended on forces beyond any sultan's control. It was both a statement of faith and a political reality. Every tributary payment to Castile was a reminder that military power lay elsewhere. But within the palace walls, the Nasrids created an environment that suggested permanence. The elaborate decoration, the flowing water, the sophisticated geometry, all projected confidence that Granada would endure. The palace complex was more than a residence. It functioned as university, where scholars taught mathematics and philosophy, as diplomatic theater, where ambassadors were received in halls designed to impress, as administrative center, where the machinery of governance operated, as statement, announcing that Islamic civilization in Iberia remained intellectually vital even as it contracted geographically. By the 1380 seconds, the main palatial structures were complete. The Court of the Myrtles and Court of the Lions. The Hall of the Ambassadors, with its 75-foot cedar ceiling inlaid with geometric star patterns. The private quarters for the royal family. The gardens with their fountains and channels. The baths with their vaulted ceilings pierced with star-shaped skylights. The vision was established. The sultans had assembled resources and craftsmen. Now came the part that would determine whether the Alhambra endured or became another forgotten fortress. The actual construction. And that construction would require materials, techniques, and obsessive attention to detail that bordered on the fanatical. Construction began in earnest in 1338 under Yusuf I's supervision. The architects and engineers he had assembled faced immediate challenges. Sabika Hill was not a level platform. The terrain varied in elevation across the site. Sections required leveling through excavation and fill. Creating artificial terraces stable enough to support multi-story buildings demanded foundations that could withstand earthquakes common in the region. The builders anchored structures to bedrock where possible. They used rammed earth mixed with lime and small stones, a technique that provided both strength and flexibility. Earthquakes could crack rigid masonry, but earth walls would flex and settle without collapsing. The technique had been refined over centuries of Mediterranean construction. Materials came from sources throughout the kingdom and beyond. The clay for the distinctive red walls was local, dug from deposits near the Darro River. Workers mixed it with crushed stone and lime, forming it in wooden frames, then leaving it to dry in the sun. The resulting material was both durable and inexpensive. Marble was more complicated. The finest marble came from quarries in Macael, approximately 75 miles east of Granada. Transporting blocks weighing several hundred pounds each required ox carts and multiple days of travel. The marble was used selectively for columns in the courtyards, for fountains, for decorative elements where white stone would contrast with red walls and colored tiles. Wood came from Sierra Nevada forests, cedar for structural beams and decorative ceilings, oak for doors and frames, pine for scaffolding. Carpenters shaped the wood on site, creating intricate geometric patterns that would be assembled into coffered ceilings. Tile production required specialized workshops. Zellage, the geometric mosaic tile work that covered floors and walls throughout the palace, was labor-intensive. Artisans cut ceramic tiles into precise shapes, small polygons that would fit together to form complex patterns. Each tile was glazed in a single color, typically blue, green, white, yellow, or black. The glaze was a mixture of metal oxides and glass, fired at high temperatures to create a hard, water-resistant surface. The Court of the Lions alone contained an estimated 10,000 individual tile pieces. Each had been cut by hand. Each had been positioned according to designs that specified not just the overall pattern, but the exact placement of every piece. The work required mathematical precision. A single miscalculation would disrupt the geometric symmetry. Stucco decoration presented different challenges. The material was lime plaster applied wet to prepared walls. Artisans had to carve the intricate arabesque patterns while the plaster remained workable, typically a window of only a few hours. Too early, and the material would be too soft to hold detail. Too late, and it would harden beyond carving. Master craftsmen worked in teams, applying sections of plaster in stages, carving as they went. The calligraphic inscriptions were carved into stucco using the same technique, Arabic script in ornamental Kufic or cursive styles. The inscriptions included Quranic verses, particularly passages describing paradise and divine creation. They included poetry commissioned for the palace. They included the Nasrid motto, repeated throughout, Wala Ghalib illa Allah. The water system was perhaps the most impressive engineering achievement. The Acequia Real delivered water from the Darro River, but distributing it throughout the palace required sophisticated hydraulics. Underground channels carved through the hill carried water to cisterns positioned at strategic points. From these cisterns, smaller channels fed fountains, pools, and baths. The system operated entirely on gravity. Water pressure was generated by elevation differences between the source and destination. The engineers calculated precisely how much drop was needed to create sufficient pressure for each fountain. The Court of the Lions fountain featured 12 marble lions positioned around a central basin. Water flowed from the lions' mouths through internal channels drilled through the stone. The channels connected to underground supply lines that maintained constant pressure. Carving those channels through solid marble required diamond-tipped drills and weeks of patient work for each lion. The basin itself weighed several tons and was carved from a single block of marble. Transporting it from the quarry to Granada, then up the hill to the construction site, then positioning it precisely in the courtyard required specialized lifting equipment and dozens of workers. The workforce at peak construction numbered in the hundreds: tile setters, stucco carvers, marble workers, carpenters, hydraulic engineers, laborers who hauled materials. Most were Muslims from Granada and surrounding areas. Some were Christians or Jews working in the Nasrid kingdom. Skilled craftsmen came from North Africa, bringing techniques developed in Fez and Marrakesh. The timeline stretched across decades. Construction began in the late 1,330 seconds and continued through the 1,380 seconds. Approximately 52 years of continuous work. Different sections were completed at different times. The Khmer's palace was finished by the 1,360 seconds. The Court of the Lions was built in the 1,370 seconds and 80 seconds. Gardens and secondary structures continued into the 1,390 seconds. The costs were substantial, but records are incomplete. The silk trade generated enormous revenue. Granada's treasury could sustain the construction without bankrupting the kingdom. Tribute payments to Castile continued throughout, demonstrating that the palace did not consume resources needed for political survival. Specific chambers reveal the obsessive attention to detail. The Hall of the Ambassadors, where the Sultan received foreign envoys, featured a ceiling that rose 75 feet above the floor. The ceiling was constructed from over 8,000 individual pieces of cedar wood, fitted together to create a geometric dome representing the seven heavens of Islamic cosmology. Each piece was carved, painted, and positioned according to mathematical patterns. The assembly required scaffolding that filled the hall during construction. The muqarnas domes throughout the palace demonstrated similar mathematical precision. Muqarnas are three-dimensional honeycomb structures where each cell is a precisely calculated geometric shape. The cells interlock to form vaulted ceilings or domed surfaces. The Hall of the Two Sisters features a muqarnas dome with over 5,000 individual cells. Each cell was carved from stucco, then assembled on-site like a three-dimensional puzzle. The structural engineering required to support such a dome without collapse required sophisticated understanding of load distribution and geometry. Every surface received decoration. Walls were covered with carved stucco or tile. Floors featured marble or ceramic tiles in geometric patterns. Ceilings were either wood coffering or stucco vaults. The aesthetic principle was horror vacui, fear of emptiness. Blank space was considered wasted opportunity. Every inch carried meaning through geometry, calligraphy, or arabesque vegetation motifs. The color palette was carefully controlled. Blue dominated, created from lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan or cobalt compounds from local sources. Gold leaf accented important elements, applied to stucco details and wooden ceilings. Red ochre from iron oxide, green from copper compounds, white from lime, black from carbon. The colors were symbolic as much as decorative. Blue represented heaven and water. Gold represented divine light. Green represented paradise. The inscriptions served multiple purposes. They were decorative, filling space with elegant calligraphy. They were didactic, teaching visitors about Islamic theology and poetry. They were political, proclaiming the Nasrid dynasty's legitimacy and piety. One inscription in the Hall of the Ambassadors read, "I am the heart of the palace." Another stated, "My walls are adorned with jewels." The construction phase was complete by the early 1392. The water flowed through channels and fountains. The geometric patterns covered every surface. The palace that had taken over 5 decades to build was ready to serve its purpose. And that purpose was more than shelter. It was diplomatic theater. A stage where the Nasrid sultans would demonstrate to foreign ambassadors that Granada, though small and tributary, commanded resources and culture equal to any power in the Mediterranean. The Hall of the Ambassadors occupied the northern end of the Commer's Palace. The throne room measured approximately 60 feet square, with walls rising to meet the cedar ceiling 75 feet overhead. When foreign envoys entered for an audience with the Sultan, they walked through a carefully designed sequence of spaces. First, the Court of the Myrtles, a long rectangular pool reflecting the palace walls and sky. Water channels on either side. Myrtle hedges, perfuming the air. The space was open, calming, designed to make visitors aware they had entered somewhere different from the city outside. From there, through covered galleries, where light filtered through carved screens, the temperature dropped. The sound of the city faded. By the time visitors reached the Hall of the Ambassadors, they had been prepared psychologically for what came next. The throne sat on a raised platform against the southern wall. The Sultan would be framed by windows overlooking Granada and the mountains beyond. Sunlight from those windows illuminated the throne while leaving much of the hall in shadow. Visitors approaching from the entrance would walk toward that light, toward the figure who controlled their kingdom's fate. The diplomatic calendar was constant. Ambassadors came from Castile, with whom Granada maintained its tributary relationship. From Aragon, whose king watched Granada's vulnerability with interest. From Morocco, where the Marinid dynasty shared religious and cultural ties with the Nasrids. From Mamluk Egypt, the most powerful Islamic state in the Mediterranean. From Italian city-states, Genoa and Venice primarily, whose merchants conducted business in Granada's ports. The audiences followed ritual. The ambassador would be announced. He would approach the throne through the length of the hall. He would present credentials or gifts. The Sultan would respond, often through an interpreter, even if both parties spoke Arabic. Water flowing from fountains in the courtyard outside provided constant ambient sound. The acoustic effect was deliberate. The gentle splash suggested abundance in a region where water was precious. Court protocol required elaborate ceremony because ceremony served political purpose. Granada was small and tributary. Military power resided elsewhere. But cultural sophistication and administrative competence could create an impression of strength that actual armies could not. The palace layout reinforced this impression. Foreign visitors staying overnight were housed in chambers surrounding the Court of the Lions. They woke to the sound of water. They looked out at geometric perfection. They walked through spaces where every surface carried decoration, demonstrating mathematical and artistic mastery. By the time they met with the Sultan, they had absorbed evidence of Granada's cultural achievement. The court itself was structured around the Sultan's extended household. Multiple wives and concubines lived in separate quarters of the palace. Islamic law permitted up to 4 wives. Concubines faced no legal limit. The resulting household could number dozens of women, their children, and the servants who attended them. Separate hammams, gardens, and residential spaces accommodated this population. Administrative staff occupied other sections. The vizier managed daily governance. Treasury officials tracked revenue from silk production, port duties, and tribute payments Granada received from smaller towns within its territory. Military commanders coordinated the small standing army and called up militias when Christian forces threatened. Religious scholars advised on questions of Islamic law and proper governance. The palace library held thousands of manuscripts, works on mathematics, particularly geometry and algebra, astronomical treatises used for calculating prayer times and religious calendar dates, medical texts in Arabic, translation from Greek originals, philosophical works, primarily commentaries on Aristotle and Plato, poetry, both classical Arabic and contemporary Andalusian compositions, legal texts, collections of hadith and Quranic interpretation. Muhammad V, during his second reign, from 1362 to 1391, patronized scholars working in these fields. He funded astronomical observations from palace towers. He commissioned mathematical works exploring geometric principles used in the palace's own construction. The intellectual work wasn't separate from the building. It was embedded in it. Ibn Zamrak served as both court poet and vizier during the 1372nd and 82nd. His compositions were carved directly into palace walls, becoming permanent features of the architecture. The verses describe the beauty of the spaces themselves, creating a recursive loop where the building praised itself through poetry commissioned by its builder. One inscription read, "I am a garden that beauty has adorned. Observe my decorations, and you will know." Evening gatherings in palace gardens featured music and poetry. Andalusian musical traditions combined Arabic modes with local innovations. Instruments included the oud, a stringed instrument similar to a lute, the kuanun, a plucked zither, the rebab, a bowed string instrument, percussion from hand drums. The performances happened outdoors when weather permitted, with fountains providing accompaniment. The palace hosted religious scholars as well, Sufi mystics who practiced ascetic forms of Islamic devotion, legal experts who debated interpretations of Sharia, teachers who ran educational programs for young nobles, training them in Quranic recitation, Arabic grammar, mathematics, and military arts. The Alhambra functioned as university as well as palace. Scientific exchange connected Granada to the broader Islamic world. Scholars traveled between Granada and Fez, Cairo, Damascus. They carried manuscripts. They shared observations and theoretical developments. The intellectual network operated despite political fragmentation. A scholar in Granada could contribute to mathematical work being done in Egypt even as their respective kingdoms maintained separate and sometimes hostile political relationships. Annual celebrations marked the Islamic calendar. Eid al-Fitr at the end of Ramadan, Eid al-Adha commemorating Abraham's sacrifice, Maulid celebrating the Prophet Muhammad's birth. These occasions brought the court together for feasts, prayers, and gift exchanges. Diplomatic guests were invited when timing aligned with their visits, another opportunity to display Granada's cultural vitality. But every diplomatic reception contained an underlying reality that visitors and hosts both understood. Granada paid tribute to Castile. The amount had increased over the decades to approximately 30,000 gold dinars annually. The payment kept Christian armies away, but also acknowledged Granada's subordinate status. Every ambassador received in splendor knew the kingdom existed at Christian monarchs' sufferance. The architecture, the poetry, the music, the intellectual achievements, all were impressive. But they did not constitute military power. And without military power, permanence was never guaranteed. By the 1462, internal problems weakened Granada further. Succession disputes created civil war. Nasrid princes allied with Christian kingdoms against other Nasrid princes. The court that had once presented united authority to foreign visitors now broadcast dysfunction. The palace had served its purpose for nearly 150 years. But diplomatic theater and cultural sophistication cannot indefinitely delay military conquest. By 1480, the Christian kingdoms had completed their consolidation. Castile and Aragon had united through royal marriage. Granada stood alone, and the palace that represented the Nasrid dynasty's permanence was about to become a trophy of their defeat. The 2nd of January 1492. Boabdil, the final Nasrid Sultan, surrendered Granada to Ferdinand and Isabella. The siege had lasted 8 months. Christian forces surrounded the city, cutting off supply routes. Food ran out. The population faced starvation. Boabdil had no choice. The capitulation ceremony took place outside the city walls. Boabdil handed over the keys to the Alhambra. Ferdinand accepted them. Isabella stood beside him. Their army, numbering over 50,000, watched from formations on the plain. The Nasrid dynasty, which had ruled Granada for 254 years, ended that morning. The treaty terms were relatively generous by the standards of the Reconquista. Muslims could continue practicing their religion. Property rights would be respected. Those who wished to leave could do so safely. Those who stayed would live as subjects of the Catholic monarchs, but retain their customs and language. Boabdil left Granada through a mountain pass called Puerto del Suspiro del Moro, the Pass of the Moor's Sigh. Legend records that he looked back at the Alhambra and wept. His mother reportedly told him, "You weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." The story may be apocryphal, but it captured the moment. An Islamic kingdom had fallen. A palace built to project permanence now belonged to Christian rulers. Ferdinand and Isabella recognized the Alhambra's value immediately. The complex was a trophy, proof that the Reconquista was complete. They spent several weeks at the palace. In spring of 1492, the same year they funded Christopher Columbus's voyage. They understood that the building's Islamic character was precisely what made it impressive. Destroying it would eliminate evidence of their triumph. But preservation came with conditions. Some decorative elements were removed. Inscriptions praising Allah were plastered over. A Catholic chapel was established within the complex. The palace would remain, but its meaning would be controlled. Ferdinand and Isabella's grandson, Charles V, took the transformation further. In 1527, he commissioned construction of a Renaissance palace within the Alhambra grounds. The new structure was massive. A square building 200 feet on each side, with a circular interior courtyard. The architectural style was entirely European. Classical columns, symmetrical facades. The visual message was clear. Christian power superseding Islamic achievement. The palace of Charles V was never completed. Construction continued sporadically through the 16th century but stalled repeatedly due to funding shortages. The partially finished building sat awkwardly within the Islamic complex, a statement of dominance that couldn't be fully executed. The treaty promises to Granada's Muslim population eroded quickly. In 1499, forced baptisms began. Muslims faced a choice: convert to Christianity or face persecution. In 1502, An official decree formalized the ultimatum: convert or leave. Those who converted publicly often practiced Islam in secret. The Spanish Inquisition investigated these converts, called Moriscos, for decades. The Alhambra's function changed. No longer a seat of government, it became a ceremonial residence for visiting royalty. Spanish monarchs stayed there occasionally when traveling through Granada. The rest of the time, the palace sat largely empty. Maintenance staff was reduced from the hundreds employed during Nasrid rule to a skeleton crew. Without regular use and adequate funding, deterioration began. The water system required constant attention. Channels clogged with debris. Fountains stopped flowing. Gardens became overgrown. The carefully designed hydraulic engineering that had taken decades to perfect fell into disrepair within a generation. In 1590, an explosion in a tower used to store gunpowder damaged sections of the fortress walls. Several structures collapsed. The accident demonstrated what happened when a palace designed for diplomatic theater was converted to military use. The architecture couldn't withstand the new function. By the 17th century, parts of the Alhambra housed military barracks. Soldiers lived in rooms that had been royal chambers. Equipment was stored in halls where ambassadors had once been received. The Court of the Lions became a training yard. The geometric perfection of the tile work was damaged by heavy traffic and neglect. Other sections served as prison. Criminals were housed in vacant wings. The palace that had hosted scholars and poets now contained thieves and political prisoners. Graffiti-covered walls where calligraphy had once proclaimed divine glory. Squatters moved into abandoned rooms. Families established residence in sections the government no longer monitored. They burned wooden fixtures for fuel. They removed tiles and marble for sale or reuse in other buildings. The slow looting continued for decades. By 1800, the Alhambra was partially ruined. Roofs had collapsed in multiple sections, exposing interiors to weather. Rain damaged stucco decoration. Frost cracked tiles. Portable treasures, furniture, textiles, decorative objects, all had been removed or stolen long ago. What remained was the architecture itself, and even that was deteriorating. Spanish authorities viewed the complex as an expensive liability. The fortress walls still had military value. Towers provided observation points overlooking the city and surrounding terrain. But the palace sections generated no revenue and required constant maintenance to prevent further collapse. Local officials in Granada repeatedly asked Madrid for funds. Madrid repeatedly declined. The question facing Spanish government by the early 19th century was simple. Should the Alhambra be preserved or demolished? And if preservation was chosen, who would pay for it? Napoleon's armies swept across Spain. French forces occupied Granada in March and immediately commandeered the Alhambra. The hilltop fortress offered strategic advantage: high ground, commanding views, defensive walls. The French converted the palace complex into a military installation. Hundreds of soldiers moved into rooms that had been royal chambers. Officers took quarters in the Court of the Lions. Enlisted men slept in halls where ambassadors had once been received. Horses were stabled in courtyards. Equipment was stored wherever space existed. The palace became a barracks. The occupation was not gentle. Soldiers carved graffiti into stucco walls. Names, dates, crude drawings, wooden decorative elements were burned for fuel. Zellage tiles were pried loose and used for makeshift repairs to other structures. Marble columns that had survived 3 centuries of Spanish rule were damaged in months of French military use. The occupation lasted 4 years. In 1812, as French forces withdrew from Spain, the commander in Granada received orders: deny the strategic position to pursuing Spanish forces, demolish the fortress. Explosives were placed throughout the complex. Gunpowder barrels in key structural locations. Towers, supporting walls, sections where detonation would cause maximum collapse. The fuses were lit on the night of the withdrawal. What happened next depends on which account you trust. The most common version names José Garcia, a Spanish soldier who had been wounded and left behind by his unit. Accounts describe him discovering the lit fuses and extinguishing them, working through the night to defuse charges before they detonated. Other versions suggest French deserters warned Spanish authorities, who sent men to disable the explosives. The details may be legendary. What is documented is the result. Several towers exploded. Sections of the fortress walls were breached. But the main palatial structures, the Court of the Lions, the Court of the Myrtles, the Hall of the Ambassadors, survived. The damage was still substantial. The Torre de la Vela, one of the primary watchtowers, was partially destroyed. The Alcazaba fortress section suffered major structural collapse. Debris filled courtyards. The water system, already in poor condition, was completely destroyed in affected areas. Spain emerged from the Napoleonic Wars bankrupt. The government had no funds for restoration of a palace that generated no revenue. The Alhambra remained in its damaged state through the 1,810 seconds and into the 1,820 seconds. Deterioration accelerated. Without roofs, interiors were exposed to rain. Stucco decoration dissolved. Tilework cracked from freeze-thaw cycles. Local residents helped themselves to materials. Roof tiles disappeared, sold or reused in construction projects throughout Granada. Marble columns were removed. Decorative metalwork was stripped. An earthquake in 1821 damaged additional sections. Weakened walls collapsed. Vaulted ceilings that had survived since the 14th century fell. The Hall of the Two Sisters lost portions of its Muqarnas dome, over 5,000 individual stucco cells reduced to rubble. By the late 1,820 seconds, Granada's municipal authorities faced a decision. The palace was deteriorating beyond salvage. Maintenance required funding the city didn't have. Guards were needed to prevent complete looting, but even those costs strained the budget. Proposals emerged. The most practical was selective demolition. Preserve the fortress walls for military use. Demolish the palatial sections. Sell the materials to recover costs. Marble, cedar wood, decorative tiles, all had value. An alternative proposal suggested converting the entire complex into permanent military barracks. This would require gutting interiors, removing decorative elements, installing infrastructure suitable for housing hundreds of soldiers. The palace would survive physically, but not as anything resembling its original form. Some visitors still came. Travelers on the Grand Tour occasionally detoured to Granada to see the exotic Moorish ruins. What they found bore little resemblance to descriptions in older accounts. Crumbling walls, garbage-filled courtyards, families living in vacant rooms, animals penned in former gardens. The water system had been dry for decades. Fountains were empty basins. Pools were drainage ditches. Estimates suggested that 40 to 50% of the original decorative stucco had been lost. Weather accounted for some damage. Vandalism and looting accounted for more. What remained was fragile. Without intervention, the rest would follow within years. In 1830, Granada's governor sent a formal report to Madrid. The Alhambra was beyond economic repair. The cost of restoration exceeded any conceivable benefit. His recommendation was clear. Preserve fortress walls. Demolish palatial sections. Recover whatever value remained in salvageable materials. Madrid reviewed the proposal. The national government had no more appetite for expensive preservation projects than local authorities. Preliminary approval was granted for selective demolition. Contractors could bid on salvage rights. The only factor that delayed immediate execution was economic. Demolition would cost money. Breaking apart structures. Hauling materials. The value of salvaged marble and wood might not cover these expenses. Contractors hesitated. Several requested surveys to assess whether the project would be profitable. The Alhambra stood on the edge of oblivion. Demolition had been approved in principle. The palace that had taken over 5 decades to build would be reduced to rubble unless something changed. And then a series of unlikely events intervened. Foreign writers arrived in Granada. They saw ruins. They wrote books. And those books changed how Europe viewed the crumbling palace. Romantic enthusiasm would accomplish what Spanish bureaucrats could not. It would make the Alhambra valuable again. Washington Irving arrived in Granada in May of 1829. The American writer was already famous. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle had made him a literary celebrity in both America and Britain. He'd been serving as a diplomat in Spain, studying the country's history and culture. When his diplomatic posting ended, he decided to spend time in Granada before returning home. Irving requested permission from the local governor to live in the Alhambra. The governor granted it. Rooms were available. The palace sat mostly empty. Irving moved into vacant chambers in May and stayed through the summer. He wrote in rooms where sultans had once governed. He walked through courtyards filled with debris and overgrown vegetation. He examined stucco decoration that rain was slowly dissolving. He talked with the caretakers and the families squatting in other sections. He took notes on everything he saw. Tales of the Alhambra was published in 1832. The book combined history with romantic fiction. Irving described the palace's beauty and its decay in language designed to captivate readers who would never visit Granada themselves. He wrote about moonlight on crumbling walls, about fountains that no longer flowed, about the contrast between Islamic grandeur and Spanish neglect. The book became a bestseller in Britain and America. Suddenly, educated readers throughout the English-speaking world knew about the Alhambra. They wanted to see it. Tourism to Granada increased. The palace that Spanish authorities viewed as worthless liability became, almost overnight, a cultural attraction. Other writers and artists followed. Théophile Gautier visited in 1840 and published his observations. The French painter Gustave Doré arrived in 1862. He created a series of detailed engravings showing the palace's architecture. These images circulated widely in European publications, further spreading awareness of the Alhambra's uniqueness. The British writer Richard Ford spent years traveling through Spain in the 1,830 seconds and 40 seconds. His detailed architectural analysis of the Alhambra appeared in multiple publications. Ford approached the palace not as romantic ruin but as serious architecture worthy of scholarly attention. These publications reframed how European educated classes viewed the Alhambra. It was no longer a Moorish relic from a defeated civilization. It was an important monument demonstrating architectural and artistic achievements that deserved preservation. The shift in perception was economic as much as cultural. If tourists would travel to Granada to see the palace, then the palace had value. The Spanish government reversed its demolition plans in 1837. The palace would be preserved. The challenge was finding someone capable of doing the work. José Contreras was appointed architect of the Alhambra in 1840. He came from a family of builders. His father had worked on restoration projects in other parts of Spain. Contreras understood both architecture and the politics of preservation. His philosophy was reconstruction rather than preservation of ruins. Where sections had collapsed, he would rebuild them. Where decoration had been lost, he would recreate it based on surviving examples. The goal was returning the palace to something approximating its original appearance, not maintaining it as a picturesque ruin. This approach generated controversy from the beginning. Some argued that restoration should be distinguishable from original work, that recreating lost elements was falsification, that honest preservation meant accepting loss and protecting what remained without adding new material. Contreras disagreed. The palace was built to be whole. Leaving it in ruins distorted what it had been. Reconstruction allowed visitors to experience something closer to what the Nasrids had created. The debate would continue for generations. The Contreras family worked on the Alhambra for 3 generations, José from 1840 until his death in 1847. His son Rafael succeeded him and continued until 1890. Rafael's son Mariano worked on the palace into the 1,920 seconds. The family's collective tenure spanned 80 years. Their work was substantial. Roofs were rebuilt and waterproofed. Collapsed sections were reconstructed. The water system was restored in the 1,890 seconds. Channels were cleared. Cisterns were repaired. By 1900, fountains were flowing again after being dry for over 70 years. The Court of the Lions fountain presented specific challenges. The 12 marble lions had been removed for safekeeping in the 1,840 seconds. In 1903, they were cleaned, repaired, and reinstalled with modern internal plumbing that could maintain water flow without the original hydraulic system. Tile work required extensive replacement. Damaged Zellige tiles were replicated. Workshops in Granada trained craftsmen in traditional techniques. The new tiles copied geometric patterns from surviving originals. Visitors looking at floors in the Court of the Lions today are seeing a mixture of 14th century tiles and 19th and 20th century reproductions. Distinguishing them requires close examination. Stucco restoration was equally complex. Plasterers studied the carved arabesques and calligraphy on surviving sections. They recreated lost elements using the same lime plaster techniques. The debate over authenticity persisted. Purists argued the new work should be visibly different from original stucco. The Contreras family preferred seamless continuity. In 1870, the Spanish government designated the Alhambra a national monument. The designation provided legal protection and increased funding. Restoration became a systematic program rather than sporadic repairs. The 20th century brought new challenges. The Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 threatened cultural sites throughout the country. The Alhambra survived unscathed. Both Republican and nationalist forces recognized its value and avoided military operations that might damage it. The Franco regime, which governed Spain from 1939 to 1975, promoted the Alhambra as a symbol of Spanish cultural richness. The irony was deliberate. Franco's government emphasized Spain's Catholic identity while showcasing Islamic architecture. The contradiction was resolved by presenting the palace as Spanish achievement rather than Islamic. The narrative emphasized Christian Spain's tolerance in preserving what it had conquered. After Franco's death in 1975, restoration became more archaeologically rigorous. The approach shifted toward preservation over reconstruction. New work was designed to be distinguishable from original fabric. Documentation improved. Every intervention was recorded in detail. UNESCO designated the Alhambra a World Heritage Site in 1984. The designation recognized the palace's global cultural significance. It also imposed obligations. Spain committed to maintaining the site according to international preservation standards. The success of preservation created new problems. Tourism increased dramatically through the late 20th century. By the 1992, over 2 million visitors walked through the palace annually. By 2010, that number exceeded 2.7 million. The human traffic was damaging what centuries of neglect had not destroyed. Footsteps eroded tile floors. Humidity from breath condensed on stucco surfaces, accelerating deterioration. The sheer number of people in confined spaces stressed structures that had never been designed for mass tourism. Spanish authorities imposed visitor limits in the 1990s. Entry became timed and ticketed. Daily capacity was capped at approximately 8,000 visitors. Certain sections were closed on rotation for conservation work. The measures protected the architecture while disappointing tourists who couldn't access all areas. Modern restoration philosophy balances competing demands: preservation of original material, structural stability, public access. Each requires compromises. Reinforcing a crumbling vault with hidden steel supports preserves the visual appearance but introduces modern materials. Restricting visitor numbers protects the palace but limits its function as public monument. The restoration debates that began with José Contreras in 1840 continue today. How much reconstruction is appropriate? Should the goal be returning the palace to a specific historical moment, perhaps its 14th century peak? Or preserving the accumulated layers of its entire history, including Spanish modifications and 19th century restorations? There are no universally accepted answers. What is clear is that the Alhambra survived. The demolition scheduled in the 1830s never happened. Irving's book and the Romantic movement's enthusiasm changed the economic calculation. What had been liability became asset. Preservation became financially and politically feasible because the palace could generate tourism revenue and cultural prestige. The architecture endured. The fountains flow. Tourists walk through courtyards in numbers the Nasrid sultans never imagined. But preservation of stone and tile is not the same as preservation of culture. The palace endures while the kingdom that built it vanished from history. What remains when architecture outlasts its builders? What do we preserve when we restore a monument to a defeated civilization? The answer lies not in the palace itself, but in what the Nasrid sultans created beyond it. The palace is preserved. UNESCO protects it. Millions visit each year. But preservation of buildings is not the same as preservation of culture. The Alhambra endures, while the kingdom that built it vanished. What remains when architecture outlasts its builders? The Nasrid Sultanate lasted 254 years, from Muhammad I's vassalage agreement in 1238 to Boabdil's surrender in 1492. That quarter millennium produced more than architecture. The Nasrid courts preserved and transmitted classical Islamic scholarship at a time when much of Europe was only beginning to recover texts lost during the early medieval period. Mathematics developed in Granada influenced later European work. Nasrid scholars worked on algebra and geometric proofs. Their astronomical calculations, necessary for determining prayer times and religious calendar dates, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. Some of this knowledge reached Christian Europe through translation centers in Toledo. More arrived later when Alhambra manuscripts were catalogued and studied by Spanish scholars in the 16th century. The hydraulic engineering techniques developed for the palace had practical consequences beyond aesthetics. The acequia system, gravity-fed irrigation channels that supplied the Alhambra's fountains and gardens, became a model throughout Spain. The technology spread to Spanish colonies in the Americas. Irrigation systems in California, New Mexico, and throughout Latin America descend directly from techniques refined by Nasrid engineers. Architectural influence was immediate and lasting. Mudéjar style. Christian buildings incorporating Islamic decorative techniques flourished in Spain for 2 centuries after Granada fell. Skilled Muslim craftsmen remained in Christian territories after the conquest. They continued working, teaching their techniques to Christian apprentices. Tile making and stucco carving traditions survived through this practical transmission of knowledge. Some of Granada's aesthetic influence was accidental. The Alhambra itself became a template that Europeans imitated centuries later. Orientalist architecture in 19th century Europe and America copied its forms. Leighton House, in London, built in the 1860s, features an Arab hall directly inspired by the Court of the Lions. Buildings at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair incorporated Muqarnas vaulting and geometric tile work. The copies were often superficial, decorative rather than structural, but they demonstrated the Alhambra's continued visual power. The poetry survived in an unexpected way. Ibn Zamrak's verses, carved into stucco walls throughout the palace, became primary texts for scholars studying 14th century Arabic literature. Most Nasrid literary works were lost when libraries were dispersed or destroyed. But what was carved in stone endured. Researchers today study those wall inscriptions as examples of Andalusian court poetry that would otherwise be completely unknown. Musical traditions traveled with refugees. When Granada fell, musicians fled to North Africa. They brought Andalusian classical music, a style that had developed in Islamic Spain over centuries. That music survives today in Morocco and Algeria, performed by ensembles who trace their repertoire directly back to pre-conquest Granada. The melodies and modes are preserved in oral tradition, passed from master to student across generations. Scientific manuscripts fled as well. Scholars leaving Granada carried texts to Fez, Cairo, and Istanbul. Some knowledge was lost. Libraries were burned. Collections were scattered. But significant portions were integrated into Ottoman and North African scholarly networks. The intellectual work produced in Granada found new homes and continued developing in different contexts. The linguistic legacy is embedded in daily Spanish. Hundreds of words derive from Arabic: alcalde, mayor, alcohol, almohada, pillow. The article al appears in countless Spanish words. Place names throughout Spain reveal their Arabic origins: Guadalajara, Guadalquivir, Alcázar. The language records a cultural presence that political history obscures. What was lost is equally significant: The specific political culture of the Nasrid court disappeared completely. Their diplomatic strategies, administrative systems, and court protocols vanished when the kingdom fell. The relatively pragmatic coexistence they managed between Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Granada was replaced by religious uniformity. The tolerance, such as it was, ended with conquest. Whether that coexistence represented genuine tolerance or simple pragmatism remains debated. Modern interfaith dialogue sometimes invokes medieval Granada as a model of religious pluralism. The historical reality was more complex. The Nasrids maintained working relationships with Christians and Jews because their survival depended on it. Pragmatism, rather than principle, drove policy. Still, the fact that such coexistence was possible, even if imperfect, matters historically. The Nasrids, built for permanence. The quality of construction in the Alhambra demonstrates that intention. Materials were chosen for durability. Marble resists weathering. Cedar resists rot. The hydraulic engineering was designed to function indefinitely with proper maintenance. They invested in creating something that would outlast their lifetimes. But they also knew their kingdom was temporary. Every tribute payment to Castile was a reminder that military power resided elsewhere. The Nasrid motto carved throughout the palace acknowledged this reality. Wala Ghalib Illa, Allah. There is no victor but God. The phrase could be read as faith or resignation, or both. Perhaps the palace's survival is fitting precisely because the kingdom was temporary. Stone outlasts political systems. The Alhambra endured because it was architecture, not governance. Buildings can be repurposed. Diplomatic protocols cannot. When the Nasrid administrative apparatus collapsed, nothing remained of those systems. But the palace could be converted to barracks, to prison, eventually to museum. The contemporary irony is notable. Millions visit the Alhambra annually. Most know little about the Nasrid dynasty or Granada's Islamic history. Surveys of tourists consistently show that many believe the palace is simply an old Spanish building. The cultural amnesia the Nasrids feared has partially occurred despite architectural preservation. The success of preservation has created its own challenges. The 2.7 million annual visitors generate revenue, but also wear down what centuries of neglect could not destroy. Footsteps erode floors. Breath, humidity, damages stucco. Managing mass tourism while preserving fragile architecture requires constant compromise. The restoration debates continue. How much of what visitors see is original 14th century work versus 19th and 20th century reconstruction? Should future work prioritize historical accuracy or visual continuity? How do you balance public access with conservation? There are no settled answers. What is clear is that the Nasrids created something that transcended their immediate political circumstances. The mathematical principles embedded in the palace's geometry influenced European thought. The hydraulic techniques they refined spread across continents. The artistic traditions they patronized survived in new contexts. The poetry carved into walls became literary evidence that outlasted manuscript collections. The palace stands as the most visible monument, but the intellectual and cultural legacy spread in ways the builders never anticipated. Ideas traveled further than stone. Knowledge crossed religious and political boundaries that would have blocked physical objects. The Alhambra today receives more visitors in a month than probably saw it during the entire Nasrid period. It functions as museum, tourist attraction, UNESCO World Heritage Site. These uses were not what Yusuf I or Muhammad V envisioned when they commissioned construction, but transformation allowed survival. The Nasrids built a palace that would demonstrate their kingdom's sophistication and permanence. The sophistication was real. The permanence was not. The kingdom lasted 254 years. The palace has lasted 785 years and counting. Perhaps that disparity teaches something about what endures. The systems collapsed. The stone remained. What the Nasrids gave away, the knowledge they transmitted, the techniques they developed, the beauty they created, defined them more than what they kept.